Richard has been a longtime friend of the center here in Ohio, has presented at many of the succession planning programs that we've done, and we're real pleased to have Richard kick off the program. And today he's going to be talking about something that is near and dear to his heart and our heart here at the center, selling your company to an ESOP. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to you, Richard.
Well, good morning, everyone. And these are always interesting experiences because we are sitting in our own little offices wondering, are we all dressed up or are we in our underwear? So I've been through many webinars and on the receiving end, and one of the difficulties is making it somewhat personal. So what we're going to try to do is go through an overview of ESOPs. Really the question is an ESOP right for you? So we're making a couple assumptions here. We're assuming that the people that are listening in today are really coming from the perspective of either working for a privately held company or representing a privately held company or perhaps owning a privately held company and are considering how an ESOP possibly could fit into your overall strategy. So what we're going to do is we're going to go through kind of a 60,000-foot overview, and then we're going to drill down into some details, and we're going to see and hear some repetition of some of the information. What I've learned as a presenter and an educator and as a business owner is that I oftentimes have to hear and see information several different ways for it to stick. So one of the first things we find, I'm going to go to our slide number 2 here, is that most people come to these kinds of events with key questions or concerns in their mind, and we want to try to address up front what those typically have been. So oftentimes the concern is, well, if I did an ESOP, can I actually retain control of my company? Can my family remain involved? Or perhaps you might be looking at a strategy to get my family uninvolved. Am I big enough to do an ESOP? How much will all this cost? I've heard that it's expensive and complicated. And then ultimately, how do I determine if an ESOP is right for me and my company? That would be called feasibility. Okay? So taking kind of a 60,000-foot view of this, really what we're dealing with in most privately held companies or closely held companies is an issue of shareholder liquidity. How do you eventually convert your stock to cash? In dealing with lots of family and privately held business owners over the years, we find that about 70 to 80% of the net worth is locked up in illiquid assets, typically real estate and the stock of a privately held company. And so that poses several issues: liquidity while living and liquidity at death. So how do you convert stock to cash? Well, one method might be to do an initial public offering. Well, the reality is that most public offerings are for companies much larger than the ones probably represented by those companies that do private ESOPs. Typically, an IPO is used to raise capital to grow companies, not necessarily to create cash or liquidity for its owners. You can see at the bottom of that graph only 6% of initial public offerings really are used for creation of liquidity for the owners. Another opportunity would be a leveraged buyout or a management buyout, or looking to consolidation through consolidator firms. In reality, very few of these actually are successful. Some would estimate only 3 of 10. They're very complicated. They generally are an all or none issue. You can't sell a part of your stock typically. There's often some complex financial issues involved, such as in the case of a management buyout, where does the management team actually get the capital to buy out the owner? And often it requires heavy leverage. So if we can't do a management buyout or an initial public offering, what's another strategy? Well, we could look for some form of stock redemption plan, sort of an inside sale, if you will. Sometimes these are difficult because the company has to finance it with debt, and that debt is not fully deductible. The selling shareholder is going to pay a lot of taxes in this type of framework, and it's very often difficult to include the family for the same reasons that a management buyout is difficult. Family members typically don't have the capital or the wherewithal to raise capital. Another alternative would be to do a merger, trying to find another like-minded company that you can merge with. These definitely can work, but they're complex. They really force the owner to deal with very complex control issues, and it's often difficult to keep the family and key employees involved in the company post-merger. The worst opportunity generally would be a liquidation, and I think everybody would want to avoid that, because a forced sale, because of poor planning or lack of planning, would ultimately depress or discount the value of the stock, and you generally get no goodwill value or strategic value in a liquidation. So finally, as you might guess, we're landing on ESOP as maybe a substitute for a stock redemption, as a mechanism to free up capital on a tax-advantaged basis, and in a way that there are some very unique deductions available through this strategy. And then finally, through this, a mechanism that you can choose to retain control even through a partial sale. So what we'd like to say is an ESOP is a mechanism where you can go public privately. So if some of you are owners, and I think some of you are, I'm trying to get to the next slide here. Come on. Okay. What is an ESOP? In its broadest sense, it's a profit-sharing plan funded with private company stock. Why in the world would anyone want to do that? Well, it could be a tool, as we've talked already, to create shareholder liquidity. It's a mechanism that can help diversify your estate. We already talked about most owners' estates are very heavily concentrated in illiquid assets such as real estate and or a business interest, and it allows you to begin a succession plan that has a great deal of flexibility. So how does this work? Well, first off, it's a lot like a 401k plan, and I use that simply because we're comfortable, most of us that own companies, with profit-sharing plans. So it's really like a profit-sharing plan, funded with private company stock. And I like to divide this into two basic types. And this is not a legal term at all, but the type 1 would be an ESOP that's primarily a benefit plan. And in this kind of environment, the company would contribute stock to an ESOP, which is just a qualified retirement plan, and the company would receive tax deductions for the contribution of stock into this ESOP. So this creates an employee benefit plan. It creates deductions that can be used to finance the growth of the company, but it doesn't create an exit strategy or a succession plan for the owner. So far fewer ESOPs are set up as a type 1 or benefit plan type of arrangement. The more common type would be what I refer to as a type 2 or a succession/employee benefit plan ESOP. And in this arrangement, what we're really looking for is some form of outside financing. So you see the lender over there in the left-hand box that would structure a loan to the business, the company, and in turn the company then would structure a mirror loan to an ESOP, okay, which is basically a trust set up for the benefit of owning privately held stock. The shareholder then, the owner, would then sell all or some of his stock to the ESOP in return for money. And so in its very simplest form, it creates diversification. It creates some cash up front to the owner, and the company gets some unique ability to deduct the full cost of that buyout. And we're going to go into the mechanics of that in a little bit. So just kind of in review, one of the incentives of doing an ESOP and going through the cost and complexity that an ESOP creates is that it creates a market for private company stock. So unlike the public markets, in the private marketplace, there is no buyer, and therefore most of you, if you've done any estate planning, recognize that there's a discounting effect for lack of marketability and lack of control. And so when you look at owning privately held stock, 30% or more of that value is really not there because there is no market for the stock in most cases. So an ESOP can be argued to create higher value because there is a marketability discount that's been reduced or eliminated. And probably the bigger advantage from my point of view is that the business owner, in a sense, controls the market for his or her own stock. So you're really creating a market for the stock. So that's kind of interesting. So some of the incentives that we're going to talk about include the tax-free rollover provision, which is under Code Section 1042, which allows you to sell the stock, defer capital gains, and we'll talk more about that as we go on, and the company can take a deduction for the buyout of both the interest payments and the principal payments. And if you can imagine, if in the mortgage market you could buy a loan from any one of our fine local institutions where the interest and principal payments were deductible, there would be a very large line outside of that bank. And then finally, S corporations have some special provisions as well for tax incentives. So what I'm going to do in the next couple slides here is go through an actual case study. This is a real-life situation.
Richard?
Yes.
Chris, quickly before we go on, we have a question.
Okay.
From Mel Duffy. From Mel, he says, I understand reduction of marketability discount, but how is it eliminated? If you could briefly.
Well, one of the reason there's a marketability discount, and this is an area, Mel, I don't know if you're a lawyer, an accountant, or an appraiser, there is definitely art and science in ESOP transactions. And what we try to do is reduce as much of the art as possible and focus on science where possible. But the valuation process that you go through, ultimately when you deal with any kind of value of a privately held company, is going to put some discounting effect into the value of that stock if it were going to be sold or transferred in a partial sale situation. And so when an ESOP creates a market for the stock, there are some appraisal firms and experts that would say that that reduces the discounting effect for not having a market for the stock. It's not a huge percentage, but it can be anywhere from 5 to as high as 15%. So that really is a valuation question, and it's subject to some interpretation by the experts in the valuation field. That's probably the best way I could answer that. Chris, maybe what I'd like to do is if we could open up the line and just go around the room. We have a small group here. Unmuted. And just what I'd like to do is ask everybody, if they're willing, just to state their first name. I don't want anybody to disclose anything private or confidential. But if you're willing, we have a small group here. Just state your first name and in sort of what capacity are you here today. It's a little bit more interesting and fun for a presenter if I kind of know, are you here as an owner representing a company? Are you here as an advisor? Are you here as an employee looking into an ESOP for your company? So, Chris, is that something you think we could do?
Yeah, I just opened up the line, so everyone is free to join in if we'd like to start.
This is Roy. I'm a consultant for the Ohio Small Business Development Centers.
All right. Thank you, Roy.
This is Paul. I'm an attorney.
All right.
My name is Perk. I'm an owner of a privately held company.
Okay. Good. We got at least one owner here. That's good. Perk. Okay. Good to have you on board.
My name is Ken, and also owner of a private held company.
Kevin. Okay.
Ken.
Ken. Okay. And if you don't mind sharing this too with the two owners, don't want to ask anything confidential about your company or even in the name of it. But if you could just state how many employees you have, it gives us just a little bit of a framework as to the size and complexity of your situation. So, Perk, how many employees do you have in your company?
We have 11 employees.
Okay. And who was the other one? Ken?
Ken, 125.
Okay. So you can see we got kind of a big range there just in our little group. All right. Let's keep going.
My name is Sarah, and I'm an attorney, trust attorney.
Okay.
My name is Mel. I own a small consulting company specializing in transition crisis management consulting.
Oh, okay. Well, if we don't succeed on the ESOP, we got to call Mel. All right.
This is Dave. I have a financial planning business with 2 employees.
Okay. All right.
This is Dale. I work for a layoff aversion program.
All right.
Hi, Elise Adler, also with layoff aversion.
All right.
My name is Charlie, and I also work with layoff aversion.
Anyone else?
My name's Dave, and I own a privately held company with 2 employees.
All right. Any other on the line here? Okay. Well, thank you for sharing that. That is helpful for me because, as you can see, we have a blend of consultant-type people, and for some of you, this program might be not detailed enough. And then we also have, a few owners, but the range of size is diverse, from 100 employees down to 2. So I think what I hopefully will be able to convey here for both the advisors and also the business owners is that ESOPs are definitely not right for everyone. And I will start off right now so that people that want to leave the conference can, is that an ESOP is a complex and sophisticated planning tool, and it is my personal bias, if you will, that it's probably been underutilized in many, many cases simply because of the complexity of it. And yet many times, just like a 401k plan has a lot of internal workings and is certainly governed by ERISA, which is a complex tax code, we've certainly gotten used to the 401k plan across the country. So it would be my estimate that a company that has a fair market value, not a strategic value, but a fair market value under $3 million, we would want to use a sort of a traffic light analogy, and that would be caution, yellow light. If it's over $3 million in fair market value, the light can stay green, but you're still looking at whether or not the company has other characteristics in terms of cash flow, profitability, and culture to whether or not an ESOP fits. When a company is sizably less than $3 million in fair market value, the cost and complexity can sometimes overwhelm the results. Some advisors would go down as low as $1 million of fair market value, but it's a fairly consistent that somewhere between $2 and $3 million in fair market value of the enterprise is probably a low end of the benchmark as to where an ESOP can be feasible from a financial standpoint. Okay, so what I'm going to do here, moving on, we're looking at a case study here, and this is a machining company out in the Toledo area that really was set up initially in 1997. A husband and wife owner. The husband was an engineer in his 40s, really the driving force behind the company. The accountant had done the estimate of appraisal, about $8 million in sales, maybe $6 million in value, and they had 2 kids that work in the business. Some of the problems that this company faced was that they don't have agreement, husband and wife, about just what they want to do with their stock, with their money, with their wealth, and actually we're in opposition. The husband wanted to give it all away and to charity, and the wife wanted to give it all to the kids. Joe is pretty much the driver behind the company, and the 2 kids were too young in the business to really fill his shoes. At that time, his hope was to be out of the business in maybe 5 years. So some of the problems then, or challenges, would be they wanted to eliminate estate taxation, provide for the continued success of the company. They had a great deal of care and concern about the impact their company had on their community, wanted to keep the options open for their kids, and ultimately, because they both had some charitable intent, they already had a family foundation set up. They wanted to create greater leverage with their business to their social legacy, and ultimately security of income for his wife. So the current estate plan is really, they didn't really have much of a plan. If you added up all their net worth and he died tomorrow, Mary would have a $12 million estate. So they had a fair amount of net worth. At the end of the day, however, if Mary died the next day, the IRS was their biggest charitable beneficiary, with half of it going there and less than half going to the kids. So one of the big problems is it didn't solve any of their goals. The government was getting too much. The kids, in the viewpoint of the husband, was getting too much. The company didn't have a succession plan in place, and so everybody was not being served. The proposed plan then that was implemented included, now you have to forgive all these lines and charts. Some of the attorneys out there might enjoy this part of the presentation. But if you look up in the left-hand corner, you see the word ESOP. So what was structured really is an employee stock ownership plan, okay? And you'll notice on the right-hand side you see lender financing. So financing was arranged to create a loan, what we call the outside loan, if you can see that. And that's $3.1 million lent to the company. The company, in turn, structured an inside loan to the ESOP, and you can see the arrow showing payments coming from the company to the ESOP, which then filter through the top arrow back to the lender. So you have this mechanism where the company's cash flow is being used to finance the loan repayments, and in doing so, get filtered through a tax-qualified retirement plan, and as such, principal and interest payments are fully deductible. So you're going to hear those terms repeated a few times because that's a very powerful aspect to this. Now, I'm not going to go through all the other arrows and charts here, but the point of the rest of this was to send the message that ESOPs can be done in a vacuum and they can work. When they're done in connection with or in collaboration with good estate planning, they work even better. So under the ESOP, you see another box that's labeled Enhanced Income Trust. And for the attorneys in there, that would be a charitable remainder trust, which can be done in connection with an ESOP. So this family actually took the stock and put it inside a charitable trust first. So the company stock was contributed there, and then the ESOP bought it from the charitable trust. There was a good reason for that. We won't go into the details of that, but it created some income tax deductions as well as a deferral of income that can be tapped into later for the family. On the right-hand side, you can see the use of family limited partnerships and a wealth replacement trust as a mechanism for the transfer and discounting of wealth. And if we go to the next slide here, we say, well, what happens when Joe dies? Okay, well, Mary is going to have ample wealth inside the marital trust, of which she has access to income, and she's also going to have access to the income that has been created through the stock that's been converted inside the charitable trust. So she's very secure in this planning scenario. And at the end of the day, when Mary dies, that's the second line, if you will, a family foundation could be funded upwards of $30 million. The IRS, you'll see, has a big fat zero, and the heirs are going to receive an ample value. And through the partnership, they're going to have some additional stock of the company, and through insurance, life insurance that's placed inside a wealth replacement trust, they'll have some tax-free dollars. So that's a powerful example when you look at the estate taxes saved, upwards of $6 million. Now, of course, today's climate is a little bit different. This was done several years ago. Capital gains, that's largely the ESOP there and the income tax savings. So you can see total savings by combining ESOP and other planning tools is very significant. And if you look at the old approach, they were going to have the family benefits net equal to about $6 million, but they were going to wind up paying a large amount of money to the government. In the new arrangement, the family controls more wealth, significantly more, by converting dollars that would go to the government to dollars that they control within the family foundation. So in that respect, there's a lot of different benefits there. So in summary, if we go off the case and we look at what are some of the benefits to the selling shareholders, liquidity and diversification, we've repeated that. The selling shareholder may continue to lead or have an active role at the company. Now, a good example, that case I just went through was done 5 years ago. At that time, the owner fully intended to have his kids come into the business, fully intended to do a second stage transaction, sell another chunk of stock because they only did 30%, and fully intended to be doing something else. Well, being the entrepreneur that he is, many things have turned out differently. One, the company has grown. Two, the kids are not in the business, his daughter, has had 2 children and has decided to be a stay-at-home mom. And his son just is not the right fit to lead and manage the company. And so they have worked hard at building the business. Anyone that knows anything about manufacturing in Northeast Ohio would know that their level of profitability has been impacted by by the overall economic climate. So doing another stage sale has not occurred, and he's actually enjoying running and managing the company. He takes a lot more time off and has worked really on building a management team that could be in place to possibly buy some part of the other stock independently of an ESOP. So basically, what's he received? He's received a good chunk of money up front. In this case, they used it for charitable purposes. He's allowed the opportunity to stay involved and in control. And if it's the case of a C corporation and they don't have a charitable intent, they can defer the gains on the sale indefinitely through selling as a C corporation. Now, what are some of the benefits of the company?
Richard, real quickly, we have a question about the C corporation and the rollover. If you're an S, you can't currently take advantage of that. And right. I guess I would add a secondary question. If they are an S and they change to be a C corp, is there any limitations on them doing so if they want to put in an ESOP?
No, just the typical rules of conversion. You can't go back and forth, but you can definitely. Here's what's happening now. In the old days, I guess before the lower capital gains, the ability to defer indefinitely the capital gains made a very strong argument to convert oftentimes from S to C corporation. And you have to look at any kind of penalties that might create, but ultimately the conversion to C corporation would allow the owner to sell and defer capital gains indefinitely if they follow certain guidelines, which we'll get to in a minute. Basically, they have to sell 30% or more of the stock, and they have to invest in a certain type of security, but it's pretty flexible. In today's climate, however, with the capital gains rate being to some at an all-time low, many are really considering whether or not they should just sell as an S corporation, pay their lumps up front, and ultimately not have to be constrained by the reinvestment rules that the Code Section 1042 require. And so we're seeing kind of a trend towards that. One of the benefits, well, let's go through the benefits to the company. So the company, in repaying the loan, in this case, if it's a leveraged ESOP, one where the borrowing occurs from the outside, the interest and principal payments, and possibly dividends, if that's necessary, are fully deductible. And those deduction limits are very much in alignment with regular qualified plan limitations. In addition, you can pay a dividend on top of those limits if it's reasonable. So in most cases, it's almost always possible to do an ESOP if you have a company that has a reasonable fair market value and decent cash flow. So oftentimes the issue isn't can a company do an ESOP, it's more should they do an ESOP. And we'll talk about that when we get to feasibility. So basically the benefits to the company is deductibility. You have some time. In a sense, think of my case study, Joe and Mary. He bought himself many, many years to determine, is my family ready to run the company? Do they want to run the company? Can they stand working with me? And he's a tough guy to work with. Do I have a management team in place? What do I do in the next several years to create that? So it buys your time to refine and work on your management succession. So the ownership succession in some ways is easy. The management and leadership succession is what's difficult. It creates a stock-based incentive plan. So, we haven't talked much about that, but the idea of helping your employees to think and act a little bit more like an owner is something that is very attractive to some companies. If you do go either convert to or are a subchapter S corporation, there's some very unique tax benefits. And basically, in very layman's terms, the portion of the company stock that's owned by the ESOP in a subchapter S corporation is passed through directly to the ESOP. And since the ESOP is a tax-exempt entity, that portion of the company's revenue or earnings would be tax-exempt. So if you were, for example, 100% S corporation and sold 100% to an ESOP, you would be 100% tax-free corporation. So when people hear that, their eyes kind of go big and glaze over. So what we have found is that there's a trend also for companies that have done ESOPs to work towards getting a larger percentage, anywhere from 80 to 100%, and then converting to the S corporation status to get that special tax preference. And this has been in the code almost 10 years now, so it looks to be holding. But ultimately, another benefit, in a sense, to the company is that the trustee holds title to the shares of the stock inside that trust. So, you do have some great protection as an employee. When you put stock inside an ESOP, it is like a qualified plan, and it's protected. And, of course, that creates some additional complexity for the company. Benefits to the employees, well, it allows the employees to obtain a beneficial interest in the company. And why that's important is just what I said. You're protected by ERISA laws that govern pension plans. It also can reduce the uncertainty of ownership transition. It doesn't necessarily mean that the company couldn't be sold down the road. We see many ESOP transactions where several years down the road, an attractive offer, side suitor, and the fiduciaries and the trustees examine that offer and make a decision that it's in the best interest of all ownerships to do so, ownership interest or stakeholders. So that can be done, and that does not mean that the ESOP was a failure. In some cases, it could be very, very profitable for all included. And then ultimately, the employees benefit because ultimately it costs less cash flow to the company net because of the deductions and so forth to buy out the owner or owners. In some cases, ESOPs are very effective when you have an ownership team that's of different ages. So I'm working with a company right now where one of the owners, the majority owners, is in his 60s, and there are two younger owners in their 40s. And so the 40-year-olds might be interested in 10, 20 years further of growth. The 60-year-old is looking at some transition plan. And so this ESOP strategy is a way of accomplishing that. This is kind of another diagram, repeating a little bit, but showing you kind of the typical leveraged or Type 2 ESOP transaction. Up at the top, you see what's supposed to look like a bank lending money to a company. Okay, that company then in turn relends that same money, and the terms of that note can be the same or it can be different, and that's one of the ways that the experts that design ESOPs, which are typically highly specialized law firms, can make the cash flow and finances work for your unique situation. So then the ESOP basically is going to have the money. So the money moves from the bank to the company to the ESOP, and then the shareholder is going to move his or her stock into the ESOP. It gets converted inside the ESOP, so there's no taxation, and provided that that cash or those proceeds are reinvested in what's referred to as qualified replacement property within about roughly a 12 to 15 month period, then that money can be reinvested without incurring a capital gain. And we'll again repeat that a little bit as we go. So that's kind of the money mechanics. Again, company contributes cash, ESOP pays promissory note, shares get allocated. We haven't talked about this yet. As the note gets repaid, the amount of that note that's repaid each year is converted to stock, and that stock gets then contributed to the participant accounts, which would be all the employees, and because it's a qualified retirement plan, all employees have to be included. There's some exceptions if you have collective bargaining or a union situation, for example, but for the most part, you have to look at it kind of like your regular qualified plan. The shares get allocated pro rata based on compensation. So the folks that are higher paid are going to get a larger portion of stock. And that stock then gets allocated over the course of several years, oftentimes 7 to 10 years, and it's directly connected, to the loan repayment in most cases. The unpaid shares or unallocated shares would remain within the ESOP. So it's entirely possible that you could sell, an owner could sell a controlling interest over 50% and still retain a high level of control in the company if that's what their preference would be. The next slide just talks a little bit about the repayment of the ESOP loan. Again, I think we've been through this several times, several different diagrams. So the note repayment, the company pays tax-deductible contributions and or dividends to the ESOP, and then the ESOP repays the loan. And because these payments are being filtered through a tax-qualified retirement plan, provided they fit within the limitations of qualified retirement plans, they can be fully deductible to the company. So that can be quite significant. Oftentimes people want to know, and it's centered around the issue of control and disclosure, what do my employees really get when they own a beneficial interest in a trust? Well, I liken it to owning a share of IBM. You can show up to the shareholder meeting in New York and you can express your opinion, but there's some limits on what you can do. And really, the only requirement or obligation that the owner has with regards to the trustee is they have to give a statement once a year indicating what the stock in their account is worth. Now, smart businesses and business owners that recognize that shared responsibility in combination with some stock ownership can create an ownership culture that produces a superior employee will invest time and energy to educate the employees as to how their impact and their role is impacting the value of the stock. And this is not something that you push a button and everyone begins to think and act like an owner. For those of you that are owners, you can relate to that. But over time and with a consistent and a consistent approach to communication and education, you can, and many companies will attest, see significant improvements in accountability, and you can see actual measurable improvements in performance of the company, sales, and stock. And there's some studies that the Ohio Employee Ownership Center could certainly provide anyone that actually measures the fact that employee-owned companies actually perform better than non-employee-owned companies in many, many cases. Now, valuation is an area that is fairly complex. Basically, I'm going to only go over the 60,000 foot here, that because the company in these examples are privately held, the value of the shares need to be determined by an appraisal performed by an independent expert. And the standard to which this appraisal has to be held to is a very high standard. So you typically are wanting to identify an appraisal firm with experience in ERISA-based and particularly ESOP appraisals. So really the appraisal firm doesn't work for the owner-seller. The owner might like that, but you don't want that because that would not be independent. The appraisal firm actually is working for the ESOP. And then the other thing is that the stock has to be valued once per year. So there's a little bit of extra cost to doing that. The front-end cost is usually a little bit higher, but once that's done, it's more of a kind of a maintenance appraisal. So it's very important that the appraisal or appraiser reports to the ESOP trustee. So that trustee, in many cases, would not be the owner. In many cases, you would not want to be the trustee. So that could be an institution, or it could be a trusted employee in the company. There's many different views on that. And that appraiser then represents the interests of the ESOP. And notice that it's a negotiation process. The trustee has to take the appraisal done by this independent expert and has to basically approve it. They don't have to be an appraiser expert. They don't have to be a tax expert, but they have to say, we've looked at the process and we believe it's a fair process. We've talked a little bit about Code Section 1042, which is just a code section that allows for the seller to incur no taxable gain on the sale, provided certain things are met, certain conditions are met. Well, one, the ESOP, at the end of the day, has to own at least 30% of the company, and you must be a C corporation for this to work. Now, you could have 3 owners, each selling 10% each, and if at the end of the transaction 30% of the stock was sold, you would still qualify. And then within a 15-month period, the proceeds of the sale need to be reinvested in what is referred to as qualified replacement property. And in general terms, that would be stocks, any domestic stock or bond. It would exclude mutual funds, any kind of managed accounts where there's pooled products, index products, mutual funds, etc. It would exclude any kind of foreign stocks or bonds and municipal bonds. One thing it does include, which often doesn't get communicated, is you could reinvest in another privately held company. So the provisions for reinvestment are pretty broad, and so what people will do sometimes is invest in a pool, in a sense sort of creating their own private mutual fund. The disadvantage of Code Section 1042 would be that if you sell any of those stocks, you then incur a capital gain. So the cost basis transfers over for those of you who are tax people and financial people. And so any type of sale incurs a capital gains. So one strategy that goes beyond this conference call is that if you're dealing with a little bit larger sale, and I would say where the value of the company is in the $5 million range or up, and you're selling 50% or so, you could take that money and basically invest it in a very long-term bond, specifically structured for this type of planning. And on that bond, you could then borrow using some very favorable interest and crediting assumptions, and use the borrowing to invest in an actively managed account. So typically that's referred to as a floater rate note strategy, and is often occurred on larger transactions to avoid the problem of having to pay capital gains tax on that initial sale. So that's sort of a different sales structure. We talked about the fact that ESOPs allow flexibility to do a partial or 100% sale. In most cases, they're done in stages, whereby you might sell a third to qualify for certain tax benefits, and then plan to sell all or some later, depending on how it works out and depending on the financial situation of the company. We talked about the fact that you can do a leveraged ESOP where you're actually borrowing money, and there are cases where there's not a requirement to borrow. You can do what's called a non-leveraged, where sometimes it's basically financed by the seller themselves. And that kind of gets us into the next slide here. I know I'm moving rather quickly, but I think our time is probably running fairly short. You have your traditional bank loan, and when you go through an ESOP transaction, you can and should work with a firm that helps you to negotiate with these banks, because there are some advantages to a bank to lending to a company doing an ESOP that are unique, and there are certain banks that favor and look for that kind of loan. If you can't qualify for traditional lending, then you can go to the senior or mezzanine or outside equity markets, which is more expensive. Seller financing would be another alternative, and in some cases, the company might use some of the money that's in the qualified retirement plan already, or perhaps they may look at freeing up some cash flow on reducing or eliminating matching contributions, for example, in a 401k plan, to make the cash flow work. In most cases, ESOPs are a bit richer as an overall benefit plan to the employees, and so with good communication, you can argue the fact that maybe the 401k plan would be frozen Maybe the pension plan, if there was one, would be taken away or modified. That requires some good communication. When you get down to the nitty-gritties, ESOP plan design, you're dealing with some of the same things one would be when you're dealing with developing a qualified retirement plan. Eligibility, the allocation formula, how are the shares going to get released to people? If you release them too quickly, you can have a scenario where you put too much stock in the hands of one group of owners or employees, and what do we do with new people coming on board down the road? Dividends, vesting, voting rights, diversification, distributions, will there be dividends? Who's going to be the trustee? And ultimately, how is this plan going to be administrated? In most cases, ESOPs are set up with a third-party administration firm, ultimately, that has some expertise in the complexities of ESOPs. So I'm going to, I guess, just ask Chris, where are we at this point with time?
Well, we started a little late because of our technical issues, so as far as the length of your presentation, we're still good. It depends how long we want to keep the folks. We could certainly open up the floor and ask folks if they want us to continue with the finish, and maybe...
There's only a few more slides, so why don't I just finish through it? A lot of this is... okay, let's do that. So let's go on to the issue of voting. Again, when we set up an ESOP, you are creating a separate entity, and that entity has to be handled in a very careful and correct way. Most of the bad stories you read and hear about ESOPs often center around either an owner not following the rules or abusing the rules. So that's why you want to have an independent appraisal done, and you want to have a trustee that makes sure that appraisal followed the rules, so that if the IRS or a disgruntled employee ever were to question the value that the owner received for the sale of his or her shares, that you could demonstrate that prudent process was followed. So normally the trustee is going to vote the shares for corporate matters. But there is also pass-through voting, which would be required for major events such as mergers, recapitalizations, reclassifications, consolidations, liquidation of the company, sale of all or substantially all of the assets. In this kind of situation where you have, for example, maybe you get a letter, you're the owner, and somebody sends you a letter and says they want to pay you $50 million for your $10 million company. Now, you actually have a responsibility when you are now set up as an ESOP. Unless it's a joke, you have a responsibility to take a look at that to determine, is that even a reasonable offer, and if it were, you might be required to look into that more carefully. Now, if you went down that path, you might want to protect yourself by hiring an independent trustee. There are, believe it or not, firms that specialize in coming in and making sure that all the I's are dotted, T's are crossed, and they would come in and take on basically the liability of dealing with that kind of situation. So you might, in a smaller company situation, the trustee could be an employee. It could be the CFO of the company, which is sometimes the case. Of course, the firms that primarily specialize in trustee work would advocate that you don't do that. But sometimes the cost of the administration and the trustee and all that can get rather high. So that's a risk you have to consider as the owner. My personal view is that if you hire good professionals to do the work, if you do this ethically and with the right intentions, you can utilize a private trustee or an employee and not run into a problem. However, when a company gets bigger, if there's any volatility, any questions, or any kind of unusual circumstance, it's probably a good insurance policy to consider hiring an independent trustee, which would generally be an institution like a bank. Okay. So next slide here really talks about management succession. When you do an ESOP, it doesn't solve the problems of leadership and management succession. And so in many cases, because you've created a plan that is designed to really treat people somewhat equally, and ERISA requires that you include everybody, you still may need and want to look at other sorts of incentives for your key managers and or someone that might run the company in the absence of the key owner. Non-qualified plans are often looked at, strategies that involve phantom stock, or something we call stay bonuses, which would be arrangements that are put in place to hold people to the company for a period of years after the owner has left, so that the management retains its strength even once the owner has left the party. The owner-founder will say. The impact on other retirement plans, the company may have to make some tough decisions about whether they can continue contributing to existing retirement plans, not just because of the IRS contribution limits, but because it might be just too expensive. So the company then has to build a good communication strategy for the employees to buy in to the idea that what they're getting through an ESOP is security of the company, security of their job, and a retirement plan that is tied into the fluctuations up and down of the company stock. So, you know, there's risk on both sides with this, but with good education, they can be very, very successful. Final two slides really talk about feasibility. For anyone that's looking into ESOP, the few owners we have here, feasibility studies come in all sizes and shapes, but the end goal is really to determine as quickly and with the least cost whether or not an ESOP is right for you, your family, and your business. And really, feasibility kind of falls into two primary categories. The left-hand category would be financial feasibility. This is the black and white, the nuts and bolts. It deals with the value of the company. I used a benchmark of maybe $3 million. The growth prospects. Are you in the buggy whip business, or are you in a growth business? Can the company qualify for financing? And ultimately, is there cash flow there based on a strong EBIT? And then ultimately, the financial feasibility study is going to determine, can you do an ESOP? Just the numbers will say, yes, you can, or no, you can't. And in most cases, a profitable company that meets some of the size criteria that I mentioned, probably with good structure, can do an ESOP. The real issue, in my view, is not so much can you, but should you do an ESOP. This is a little bit harder to define because it's driven by the culture and values of the owner. They have to think about how much they need from the company. They need to deal with some of their own personal issues revolving around their family, whether or not the family is going to stay in the company or not. Issues of management succession are difficult. They're not black and white. And then ultimately, how long do you want to retain control of the company, and when do you want to leave? So those are the non-financial issues. When you blend the two together, then you come up with an overall game plan, and you can begin assembling the team of experts that are required. Just in summary, the people that are required to do an ESOP and maintain an ESOP would include generally some quarterback, if you will, someone that can coordinate the feasibility. That might be a financial planning firm, for example. You need to have an appraisal done, and there's different ways to get that done. You need to have ultimately, in most cases, two lawyers, one that represents the seller, which would be the owner, so that might be your current counsel, and then you want one that represents the ESOP, one that has expertise in the construct design of these kinds of plans. And there are, a relatively small handful of ESOP attorneys around the country, and there's several here in Cleveland and other areas. And then you're going to eventually want to have a third-party administrator, somebody that has some expertise in doing the record keeping of the ESOP. Your current third-party administrator for your 401k plan could possibly do the job, but oftentimes they lack interest or experience in ESOP. And then finally, you may eventually look to having some consultants that help in getting the employees to better understand and appreciate employee ownership as as a vehicle for growing their wealth and their companies. So there are, in some cases, educational programs that you can get through, partially through Kent State and other folks that do that. So those are the experts, I guess, if you will, that you need to do feasibility. And I think, Chris, I'm going to stop.
Okay.
We kind of hit a lot of stuff. It's kind of hard when you don't have the feedback directly, but let me stop and see if there's any specific questions.
The conference has been unmuted.
What I would offer to anyone on the line, since our time may be limited here, if anyone wants to get into something very specific, certainly you're free to call me offline and we can just chat. So I leave that open for you.
Can you give folks your phone number?
216-328-5538.
Okay.
Or you could just send me an email if you prefer that. It's rtanner at, and this is all one word, Ownership Advisors, ownership, ADVISORS.com. So happy to help where I can.
Okay, sounds great.
Remaining minutes, if we have any specific questions, be happy to try to entertain them.
I just want to let folks know that we have opened up all the phone lines so we can all hear you. And if we have any questions for Richard, again, I apologize for starting a little bit late and running a little bit late, but that's our technical thing that hopefully as we do this we'll get better. But I'm going to open the floor for questions. Okay. Well, I think at that point I want to thank Richard for excellent presentation and getting the information out there to you folks. Just let folks know we're going to archive this webinar on our website, so it'll be available should you want to go back and view it. And I think at this point we'll be ending the webinar. If you want to register for additional webinars, they're available on our website. And as we move forward, we'll be doing more and more and scheduling more and more as we go on. So thank you and have a good day.
Thank you, everybody, for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you, Richard.
Bye-bye.